most things, we make sense of the world through story. We make sense of the world through the stories that we take in. We make sense of the world, the stories we share with each other. And we certainly make sense of the world through the story that we've been telling ourselves our whole lives. And that story isn't fixed. And I believe that for the longest time, I had a sense of identity and a sense of fixedness to the way things were, because that's the way that it's always been. What I really appreciate is the neuroplasticity of life experience and the idea that we can be collaborators in not only the writing, but the rewriting.
Welcome, everybody, back for another episode of Woven Wings Live. I'm your host, Gabe Crane. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Rahul Deedwania. And we are here for another episode of bringing you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. And if you enjoy listening to us, I just ask you to share this work with a friend. We love having this message and the topics we explore on this show reach as many folks as possible. You can also leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow along our journey. If you're not already watching this on YouTube, you can find a video of the podcast as well as different clips and highlights on our YouTube channel. You can join our newsletter as well, all the links of which are shared in the show description. And today we have a very interesting episode. We're titling it Story, State, Space, and Synergy. And we're joined by our guest, Joseph Ariel Town, who is a performer, writer, director, and teacher based in the Los Angeles area, award-winning coach around mindset and performance. And today we're going to get to hear about his own very interesting background around his personal journey, his background in Feng Shui, and what that's led for him to in terms of personal transformation and integration. And so on that note, Rahul, it's really good to be with you again. I'm just kind of curious, you've had a lot of interaction with Joe, I think, in the lead up to this more than me. I'm curious, what are you looking forward to in our conversation? What's kind of getting sparked as we think about, these very interesting, we got story, state, space, things around identity and personal names that we're going to be exploring here. What's speaking to you and alive for you as we get into this topic today?
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. I mean, first off, I think just peeling back the curtain a little bit for our listeners on our own process, I think we have started to move more in the direction of just flowing with the conversation wherever it goes and not presupposing, the focus areas and topics as much as we used to. And so just excited to continue down that road and see what comes up organically. But I think more generally, or more specifically, I should say, to what you're asking, I think the question of identity and integration of different parts of ourselves that come from so many different parts of our history, our experiences, our stories, I think that is a piece that I'm particularly interested in. I think it's something that is universal, in terms of a challenge that people face. And so very excited to certainly hear about it from Joseph's standpoint, but also in the course of the conversation, use that to reflect on each of our, own parts, right? And what's coming to the forefront now, what's in the background, what does it look like, or how can we imagine all of that being integrated? So very curious, just to see where that goes. And that's primarily where my head's at. How about yourself?
Yeah, I think that's well put. The other piece that's really interesting to me about Joseph's background is its relationship with art. So Joseph Ariel, he's an award-winning writer, director, performer. And I just think, it's so interesting. We're talking about the inner to the outer and the outer to the inner. The process of personal integration and transformation, it's also becomes some kind of expression, right? It becomes art, some sort of version of art that we're putting out as our life, or very formal art that we do. But our lives are kind of pieces of art. And I think the personal journey of seeking that understanding and integration is kind of how that art germinates and becomes something that someone on the outside looks at and goes, wow, that's so interesting. How did that possibly come to be? And I think we often lose sight of that life, yes, it's about our survival, it's about our happiness, but it's also about our creative expression. It's about our articulation of beauty, giving voice or embodiment to a sense of artistry and beautiful meaningfulness in the world. And so I'm really interested, given Joseph's positionality here in the world and what he does for work, and yet we're going to be talking with him about a more personal topic, just to really explore that idea that, yeah, what we make beautiful when we polish the tile, so to speak, try to create the diamond inside ourselves, it also transforms into how we show up in the world and really who we are to ourselves and to other people. I think that's going to be an interesting part of this conversation to dive into.
Yeah, I really, really love that characterization, Gabe, of our life as art, and our life as an art piece that's continuously evolving, continuously changing, through our own creativity, through the interaction with the world, with others. That image is really sticking with me. So thank you for putting that out there.
Yeah, for sure. So before we go further, let's bring on our guest, Joseph Ariel Town. So you might know him. If you know Joe or Joseph or Ariel, you might know him through different identities. This call today is, I guess, part of the integration process. We're bringing these identities together. But Joseph Ariel Town, he is, as I said, award-winning Los Angeles-based performer, writer, director, and teacher. He is the co-founder and CEO of the Performer's Mindset, where Joe works with performers to elevate their craft, with core professionals to bring mindset practices into the workplace, and with creatives of all types, preparing them to show up at their best in life's big moments. He's also the host of the Better podcast, where Joe is exploring elements of the creative process. And really, as we've spoken to, Joe has a very interesting background. So also has another name and identity as Joseph Ariel. He has a Feng Shui background, which is how we're going to be getting into space and story, and to hear his story, his own introduction to these areas of energy, these kind of invisible senses of space, or what really started connecting him with his own inner world and inner journey to discover himself. So we're going to be getting to explore really how all those things have led Joseph to where he's at. On that note, I wanted to invite you, Joseph, if you want to join us here on live, and welcome to Woven Wings Live. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
You guys, I am so excited. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you for navigating so many of the different parts of what this conversation holds and for welcoming me on today. I'm not only grateful, I'm already inspired and curious.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this, because we used to, Rahul mentioned, that we've been adapting our format, and we used to be very, when we were new podcasters, we used to be very controlling and organized and detailed about the process, which is a good thing, but we would script things out at questions. Okay, this question is going to flow to that question, and now we're just at this place where it's just like, well, let's just turn the camera on and press record, and then let's just hang out and see what happens. And I think we're really pushing the envelope on that today, because what we're exploring here is just, even Joe, like, referring to you via three names, right? Like, okay, are you Ariel? Are you Joe? Are you Joseph? Are you an acting coach, or are you a Feng Shui expert? Or I think maybe for some people, listening to this, it might be hard to locate the conversation at first. Sometimes we go in with this idea of like, well, what am I going to get from this? I'm listening to this podcast, right, to absorb X piece of information. And I guess I will ask that to you first as just a framing for people. But I just feel like what we're getting to really dive into today is story of personal growth and transformation, personal journey around identity, and then how that's also interfaced with your professional career and your professional success. And so I think, really on this show, we are exploring how to live healthy and happy, vibrant lives that are connected to the deepest truths that we have inside ourselves. And so I'm really stoked for this conversation, because I feel like we might not be able to locate or name where this conversation is, but it's very much about the journey that you've had to become a more whole and true version of yourself, and how that's affected your work professionally. And so let me pause there. I think one version of this question is, what is the audience going to get out of this today, if you're listening to this? But another way of putting that might be, you heard us try to put a spiel on this topic today. How would you describe your own journey to being here, and what you're excited to share with our community?
Well, the three words that I heard about your mission and vision is health, healing, and vibrancy. And I think that really dovetails beautifully with story, state, and space. And it really is a through line that we may find in the journey to now. And like most things, we make sense of the world through story. We make sense of the world through the stories that we take in. We make sense of the world, the stories we share with each other. And we certainly make sense of the world through the story that we've been telling ourselves our whole lives. And that story isn't fixed. And I believe that for the longest time, I had a sense of identity and a sense of fixedness to to the way things were, because that's the way it's always been. What I really appreciate is the neuroplasticity of life experience and the idea that we can be collaborators in not only the writing, but the rewriting of our story. My story begins on the East Coast of the United States. I was born upstate near Albany, and I was born to some very artistic parents. My mother was a fine artist and a painter and a poet and a mystic, and she had really connected to a beautiful community up there. And she met my dad, who at the time was a DJ on the radio in New York City. And his passion for music led him to being creative by telling stories through the music that he played. And at that time, getting to choose what music got played in what order. Their relationship really felt like a powerful storm of energies that came together. They were together 2.5 years in total. And the story that my mother likes to tell about that is that it really was about me coming through them and me coming into the world. Ironically, the day that I was born, apparently almost every weather condition possible happened. Lightning, snow, rain, sunshine, rain, like everything happened weather-wise, which really metaphorically makes sense of the energy that they had. It was very passionate. They moved in together after 3 days. 2.5 years later, I was living with my grandparents and my mom on Long Island. And so now as a single mom and he trying to figure out what he's doing to be a provider in this vision he has of being an artist on the radio, my mother met another man when I was about 1.5 years old. And together we moved to a communal living situation on Long Island, a non-denominational, not rooted in any particular philosophy. It was just a collection of amazing humans, artists, teachers, mathematicians, and they all wanted to live intentionally. So they were living in this 10-bedroom mansion that was on a mile of private beach. And the only rule they had is that everybody had to agree for somebody to move into this space, that rooms would go empty. I think it was like $1,500 a month to rent this place, which was a lot for one family, but for each couple to spend $75 a person to have access to this beautiful old home was pretty powerful. So my stepdad, who became my stepdad, but my mom's boyfriend at the time, my mom and I moved there. And it was my first experience having like this collective of people caretaking and guiding. And I was the only child. There was a dog, but I remember some of the people that lived there who I still know today practiced what it would be like to be a parent having me there. And so at that time, I was still Ariel. My birth name in the world was Ariel. And I say Ariel because that's what everyone pronounced it as on Long Island in New York. In fact, my hippie parents gave me a nickname, which was Blue Star. And if we want to go down that road, there's a whole lot of other names. My mom changed her name from Rosemary to Crystal Star. She claimed her name as an artist in the world. So all of her art is signed with a crescent moon and a star, which is the symbol of her as Crystal Star. Taking a name is part of my family legacy as well. But I was given the name Ariel. I was given the name Blue Star. And when I was 5, I said, I want to be Little Joe. I want Joe Town, my stepdad, my mom married him when I was 5. I said, I want him to be my dad. So I took this name, Little Joe, and I was registered in school as Joe Town. But that didn't go over so well with my biological family, my dad's side. And so they kept referring to me as Ariel. They didn't want to call me Joe, the name that I asked for. So it became this metaphor of 2 homes, 2 names, and within me, this sense of having to adapt to the environment I'm in. I have requests in the world. Some of them are being met. Some of them are not being met. And it was my first time claiming anything like that. And so it began a really ongoing internal challenge for me, but it also primed me when everything came to a head, I would say around 13. I went through a period of time where I cut off speaking to my biological father. I fell in love with acting and found my voice. I had suffered from a lack of confidence and had ulcers in the world, and acting to me really saved my life. It gave me a voice and it allowed me to express myself differently than I ever had. It was something that I enjoyed. I didn't know if I could do it. I was nervous. I had wanted to try out in middle school for a play and I chickened out. But my high school English teacher noticed something and invited me to stand up in front of the class and recite a Shakespearean sonnet, and then invited me down to a rehearsal to see what they do in the theater. And I loved it from day one. And I was invited backstage. I did crew. I was offered a voiceover role in The Miracle Worker. And that was my very, very first play. I was the offstage voice of Jimmy Sullivan, Annie Sullivan's dead brother. And was fortunate to be in a school that really had arts funding and that cared about artistic expression. And so through being on stage and then eventually directing, I did about 30 productions in those 4 years. I went away to an acting camp and discovered that's what I wanted to go to college for. And I ended up trying to decide between a split, New York or LA, 2 totally different vibes. And I chose to try to establish my own identity and go across the country and go to the University of Southern California, where I came out to pursue a degree in acting. And I thought I was going to double major in film, but the course load would have been way overwhelming. My roommate was film major, my best friends were in the film school, and I found out that you couldn't really audition for things as an underclassman for a lot of the main stage productions. So I marched myself over to the film school and I gave them a headshot and a resume, and I started working on film. And I did the worst work of my lifetime on film because everyone's figuring it out. Like, fortunately, I didn't have a lot attached to it. Like, I cared a lot, but I didn't watch a lot of the films, which was a good thing because at that time I was so harsh on myself internally. I may have stopped. I had a hard time seeing myself in the mirror. I had a hard time seeing myself when I did see glimpses on film. I was like not comfortable at all. And I remember my junior year, I finally worked on a film and came back and told my roommate, I was so proud. I was like, I'm proud of my work in this. I feel like I look good. I feel like the whole film looks good. What I didn't realize is that they're also learning. They're learning about lighting and editing and obviously directing. So that collaborative experience was incredibly powerful. And I think that for a variety of reasons, I decided to finish school early. I had been working as an intern for 20th Century Fox. I was offered a producing track, and I ended up having this impulse. I came home for Thanksgiving my senior year. I knew that I was going to graduate early because I was on a scholarship and I needed to honor some of the help I was getting to complete school. And so I overloaded my course load. I was writing plays, I was interning at Fox, and I came home for Thanksgiving, and all I wanted to do was move to New York City. And it was my first time feeling that. And so I had this story in my head that I was going to move to New York before my friends graduated and start a theater company, and they would all move out there and we would, be like the Muppets, and we would, save theaters from destruction by oil tycoons. I ended up actually going back to New York because it turns out that my mother was sick and that she was going to die about a year later. And I didn't know this. So the spiritual reason that I ended up moving back to New York was to be with her. And while I was in New York, I traveled to Europe and did plays over there. And she found out how sick she was at that time and revealed it to me while I was away. And when we came back, she said, I want you to take me on a pilgrimage to India. I want to see a holy man named Sai Baba. And Sai Baba had been around our home through this incense that my mom would always burn called Nag Champa, which made me aware of him. He was on our fridge. My mother was she was raised Italian Catholic. My dad's side of the family is Jewish, and neither of them wanted to raise me with a religion. So I was just exposed to different spiritual practices. And we had Tai Chi masters who would come and offer classes on our front lawn, and I would kind of be forced to meditate. I didn't really love it when I was very young because I was impatient and I didn't really get it. But we held hands and we owned at the table instead of saying grace. And that was the sort of secret world that I was in. Meanwhile, it was like the 80s on Long Island when that was probably not very cool. And so hiding behind the name Joe at that time was like a cloak of invisibility where my weirdness could get masked and I could try to fit in. There you go.
And Joe, actually, I wanna jump in there because what you've laid out is just such a rich and for me like a unique story of your upbringing. It seems like there's so many rivers, flowing together and meeting at the point that is you, right? And even what you were just describing as that dinner time ritual is a combination of so many different things. And I want to, kind of tie the thread back to what you said around story, right? And how story is formed through all these different influences. And often we view it as fixed and sometimes, but it's actually very empowering to know that, hey, you can actually rewrite your stories. And the point that I've been mulling over as you've been sharing all these different parts of your story is typically, when I think about story, there's actually some comfort in parts of our story being fixed. I feel like it gives us some stability. And then on the other hand, like knowing that we can rewrite our stories gives us a sense of agency, of power, of sort of creative just potency. And I think what I'm finding so unique about your story, and even what you were saying around, hey, hiding behind the name Joe, is for most people, their name is a part of their story that's fixed. And to hear that, hey, you were at asking for a different name, asking for a different identity, that just like stuck out to me. And then to say, hey, even 20 years later, you come back to New York, you have all these blend of influences within yourself, but Joe, the name that you'd asked for at 5, actually became a shield for you, right? A place where you could, behind that name, you could work out all the things that were happening internally, but it gave you a little bit of protection, sort of an external sense of belonging. That's just like, it's just like, it's so fascinating to me because I think a name is something that I've never thought about in that way, that the name holds so much of a story and so much of our identity in it, but that, hey, even a name is fair game to be rewritten or to be related to, in a way that's maybe different from how we did growing up. With all of that, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this idea of, what is the role of having parts of our story that are fixed and parts that aren't? And how do we exist in that in between where we're constantly figuring out like which ones do we want to be fixed and which parts do we not? And it ties so much to me to your story around your relationship to your name. And so would love to kind of keep hearing about that with that question in mind.
I love that you brought up that our names have a lot of power to them, and whether they're given to us and we come to understand what the intention was behind it or what the name means, or whether we claim one for ourselves, this is part of our signature story. And so Gabe, I would imagine is connected to Gabriel, which is the name of an angel, right? A messenger of kinds. And I don't know what the specific origin is for you, but when I think of Gabe, I think of Gabriel, the angel. And when I hear Rahul, Ra feels like it's connected to the sun and masculinity. And I don't know the whole part yet, but each of our names contains this story before we even come to understand what it means. And then there's like a chance for us to rewrite what that means. So Ariel, which only one friend in my whole life ever pronounced that name Ariel. And Ariel means lion, lion of God. And it's a protector. And it also has a lot of other meaning in Shakespeare and poetry and in the Bible and different things like that. Whereas Joseph means bringer of hope. So if Ariel is a proud messenger and Joseph is a bringer of hope, that feels important as part of my story. But of course, my story before was this is something that contains pain, right? The name Ariel contains pain because I asked for something that I wanted in the world that was hard for me to do, and it wasn't met. And then when my parents divorced, I sat down. The scariest day of my childhood was going to my therapist office and sitting down with my mom, my biological dad, my stepdad, maybe my brother, maybe my mom's boyfriend. I can't remember now how many bodies were in the room, and to ask for one thing from each of them. And I just remember the amount of fear. Like that was my first experience maybe performing. I mean, I was a young athlete. I enjoyed soccer and baseball, but I don't remember feeling that kind of pressure. But going into this room was so nerve-wracking, the anticipation, the dread, the inner nerves, and not knowing how to manage them all. And the only thing I really remember was that it was scary to speak up. I was glad I did when I did, and that not everyone met my request. Again, it was like the second time in my life that I made a request that felt hard to do and that I wasn't met. Not across the board, but just in one particular instance. And so now in the world, jumping ahead for a moment, as a coach and as the embodiment of the work that I not only do as an artist, but that I do as a coach and a teacher, the concept of growth mindset I know is a buzzword that people throw around a lot. And it's trained now as early as elementary schools. It's taught in parenting circles. I think the idea of having a growth mindset is something that everybody raises their hand to. Like if I go into a room full of strangers, how many of you want to get better? Every single person raises their hand. How many of you would like to have a growth mindset? Everybody raises their hand. But when push comes to shove, I noticed that people default to a fixed mindset. And part of that is, as you said, it's about comfort. Now, I think there's beauty in that. Knowing our preferences is beautiful. Deepening connection and telling a story like, hey, tell that story that I love really is bonding and comforting, but it doesn't provide growth. So I think if we want to zoom out for a minute, I think the idea of where we're coming from as we organize our thoughts, words, and actions. And this could be on a micro level, like just for this moment or for this conversation or for today, or it could be how we organize our whole life. Are we more organized towards growth? Or are we more organized towards comfort? And so a fixed mindset has value, and also it comes with some traps. It comes with the traps of trying to prove ourselves more. It comes with all kinds of different things that there's maybe like a toxic version of that goes beyond just comfort, where parts of our courage atrophy. And if we're growing all the time, what we've learned is like that's not sustainable either. So when you talk about health and when you talk about vibrancy, you can't be vibrant in constant growth mode. You need time to recover. So I think one of the things we're learning from elite athletes is how to recover better than ever before. And I think that is a disruptive force to the hustle and grind culture that so many people buy into and that feel like is necessary for success. I'm going to pause there. Did I start to answer your question?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you want to speak to that, Rahul, but I'm really curious, Joseph, around coming to the present moment. You're talking about the integration of your names. And so through the story, I mean, obviously there's a lot of twists and turns to your personal journey, which is very evocative, right? Because I mean, you hear one person's story, it's just like, it's amazing. We all have these stories, right? They track back, you start adding on the years as you get up there. And it's like, wow, like there's a lot of history here, right? Going down memory lane and being with you as a 5-year-old, in that communal house, or having that desire then. And then fast forward to the present moment, and you're in a process of integrating those identities or reclaiming those. Like the name Ariel, that has pain in it, now is being reclaimed by you and pronounced the way it was, originally intended in its original language, right? And I guess I think that'd be a great place to dive in as well. Is just why what has inspired you and motivated you? Why is it meaningful to you now to bring those to revive that name and to bring these parts of your identity together?
If you'll indulge me, I would love to just do a quick montage of Act Two of the name, because it'll set up the answer to the question. So without being slow motion mode, we went to India on a pilgrimage. When we came back, my mom passed away a few months later, and I was in a lot of pain, but I was masking it pretty well. I had a sense that mindset would help us, and I really had bypassed a lot of the initial grieving and told myself that I was fine until I wasn't fine. It led me to move back to Los Angeles. I connected with two people that really changed my life. I met a naturopath who ended up eventually introducing me to a feng shui master, and I ended up meeting an improvisational teacher named Gary Austin, who started the Groundlings Improvisational Theater Company and taught me to say yes to life again. Around all that time, I'm now in the industry. I've gotten agents and managers, and they're trying to figure out what to call me. And so I tried integrating my names. I tried being Ariel Joseph Town. I legally changed it to Ariel Joseph Town. And this was my next attempt to integrate. And the problem was, it confused a lot of people. So some people had known me as Ariel, some people had known me as Joe Town, and all of a sudden people are like, we don't have an appointment for Ms. Town. Or, who's Ariel? Do you mean Joe Town? Of course he can come in and audition. So now all of a sudden, I've now confused people that are producers and showrunners and actors and other people I might get to collaborate with. And that was not my intention. So on the side, I've developed this interest and passion for life coaching and feng shui. I have this feng shui master who is from Hawaii. He's from Lahaina. I met him in Los Angeles, and ostensibly together with him, we made a decision that I was going to publicly face the world as Joe Town, the actor, because it comes from a different energy. That's how I was going to show up. And that when I did my feng shui and my life coaching work, I was going to be Ariel. This way, I knew what hat I was wearing, and it was really easy for me to navigate. I know the energy I'm coming from when I go into these spaces. Over time, I started to feel more and more fragmented. I had multiple jobs. I had these two halves of me. Eventually, even up until recently, I'm managing multiple newsletter lists. I'm managing different social media platforms. This split continues. And even when I was married, I was finally I'd been through relationships where they saw one side of me, but couldn't really appreciate the other side of me. And then I would go to the other end of the extreme and be with somebody who would see the other side of me, but not all of me. I was in a partnership where somebody saw both sides of me, and I made an attempt to be one Joe for a period of time while I was married. But ultimately, our relationship was for a period of time, and it was to help birth a son that I now have named Lucas. And even though our relationship didn't continue, I'm really grateful for that time. I'm really grateful for the time that we came up as early artists and that we created this beautiful life. Ultimately, in the time after and towards the end of that marriage, I really had to look at myself in the mirror and understand why I felt like I had built this tiny house around myself, why I felt invisible in the world, why I was in so much pain around people. And a lot of it was stemming from this sense of disintegration, of feeling split, feeling like I was constantly having to adapt to everybody else in the world. And I needed to go on another healing journey for integration. And the healing journey would take several years and take several people. And so I've now been in a new partnership for about 2 years. And it has been one of the most powerful and transformational relationships of my life, being seen and met on all of the levels, and feeling like that has provided the ability for me to step into deepening, integrating, and claiming all of who I am. At the same time, I can't do that inner work without it affecting my outer reality. And even at the beginning, I was hearing the bio that you so beautifully shared. And I'm like, how are people going to latch in at 3 different names and 6 different titles of what I do? And so often I would just adapt saying what I did at a party based on the human standing in front of me or the conversation we were having. And there's that adaption again. I'm adapting, I'm adapting. And so I went through a breakup with this person that I'm so deeply and madly in love with and feel like the universe brought into my life and with whom I've done so much healing. And part of it was that I had some work that I needed to do. I had some work I needed to go clean up. Some of it started from when I was really little, tackling literally a storage unit with 32 tubs of my mother's items. And so here's this person who's spent 20 years in the feng shui space and who had been putting this off. Can you imagine getting to the point where you want to move in with somebody and being like, hi, here's me. Here's my child who will be visiting sometimes. Here's all my stuff. By the way, 32 tubs of my childhood stuff, my mother's items, journals. Can we take time away from life to deal with that? I don't want to give somebody that experience. And so during this soul's awakening, this lonely work, this crisis moment, it really invited me to deepen and clean. And so this year, these last couple of years, this final stages of healing and integration, I finally heard what I want to be called. I was on a vacation that turned into a bit of a spiritual adventure down in Mexico. And while I was there, I heard inside what I want to be called. And it has to do with my heart, it has to do with my knowing. I had been through a period of time where I stopped knowing myself and stopped knowing in terms of my belief system in the world. I had defaulted to hoping and being passionate about and intending. But I was asked a question by her, do you know? And I couldn't truthfully answer. So I had to go on a journey to figure it out. And I realized that at times in my life, I have known and I have had knowing. And I felt disconnected from it. And then I wondered where it happened and why. And the voice that I heard inside said, of course you know. You have the heart of a lion, and it's in your name, Joseph Ariel. And it was the first time in my life that I'd ever said to myself how I want the name Ariel to be pronounced. And I wanted Joseph up front. And so coming out of that, it has been this slow integration of that knowing into my day to day, my awareness, the stories that I'm aware of, that I tell myself, that I tell the world, and how my companies are really not companies, but they are programs. So I don't think I've ever spoken about this publicly yet, but I think in getting curious about what I do in the world, I've been looking for a way to say it that integrates everything. And really, my favorite story of all time is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. And my best friend of 20 something years said, you know who you are. You're an alchemist. You've always been an alchemist. And I was like, wow, I'm really resonating with that. But what kind of an alchemist? Like that sounds like something that's done in laboratories and deserts and dealing with philosopher's stones and turning lead to gold. And I realized that what I do is human alchemy, that I help people identify the heavy leaden parts of themselves and I give them golden wings. I help give them golden wings. And so all of this is so new. It is not even out on a website or in public consumption. But I'm sharing it with you because it's really the answer to your question of like, how do we anchor into something? What is the one thing that I do? Because as an actor, as a coach, as a feng shui master, as a creative producer, they all fit under this umbrella of human alchemy in terms of the stories we tell, in terms of telling better stories, first to ourselves, and then recognizing that story comes from somewhere. So the integration of story and state, which we can get into, and that state is influenced by the spaces we occupy. So there's a direct correlation between story, state, and space. And when all three are in alignment, that's where synergy happens.
Wow, that was just a beautiful ride. I think just hearing all of this, and I think so, Joseph. What was really striking me about your story, right, is that your name is this externalization, or your journey with your name is this externalization of an experience that I think a lot of us face, even if it's not as explicit or as obvious, right? And what I mean by that is I think about how I show up, to one set of friends versus another, how I show up with my wife, how I show up with my parents, as a son, how I show up to work, right? And I think there are these different identities that start to form. And in my case, under the umbrella of the same name, but they're actually different. Right. And this idea of being myself wherever I am, I think sometimes I feel like I am being myself, and other times I feel like I'm adapting, like you said, right? Conforming to what that environment is asking of me, or what that environment considers, or what I consider to be safe in a particular environment. And that is something that I feel is a pretty ubiquitous and potentially even fairly universal experience. And it's the one that, often when you hear about people who have really found a deeper level of fulfillment in their lives, it comes from having gone to the other side of that, right? Having found the integration that you're talking about and not necessarily having, again, the name or the public brand to work through that, but something within, right? Where oh, it all feels like it's the same vessel, even if it's in a different environment. And so the part of what you said that really stuck out to me was you experienced this sense of knowing and putting aside, what sounded like the culmination of that experience in your journey in Mexico, but that you'd also felt this sense of knowing at other points in your story. What I'd love to just hear from you and understand is what is that experience of knowing? How would you describe what it feels like to be in that sense of knowing, to be in that sense of alignment, that sense of confidence is what I've sensed and heard that like, yes, this is true, right? This is true for me. This is something that I know that I feel sure about as much as one can. What is that like?
Somatically, I think that there are places that we might recognize that our knowing resides. Our bodies are incredibly wise. And I love that you introduced both knowing and confidence because confide, the idea of doing things with faith, or courage, the idea of doing things with and from our heart, I think are connected to how we know. I've always been around people that are very intentional. The community that I grew up in was very intentional. And intention feels like the first part, moving in a particular direction. And then there's maybe a passion, an energy that intention connects to. Like I have a desire to be intentional or desire to have a specific out. And depending upon what energy we're coming from, that intention either fizzles out as we realize that we're only operating from a place of hope. I hope this works out. I hope that this happens. And part of that experience is determined by the energy that we're coming from. For me, the best way I can describe it is that my life goes better, my performances go better, my relationships go better when I am full and giving from overflow. When I am fully connected to myself, I have taken moments to check in, to nourish, to deeply rest, to take care of my mindset, to fill up with the things that matter the most to me, the things that move the needle, and the qualities that I want to bring into my relationships in the world. What are those qualities that I want to fill up with and prime within me that allow me to share that when I go into the room or when I go into a conversation? That fullness is my knowing. It's connected to my knowing because I've connected deeply within. I've heard this phrase that there's like that still voice within. And for the longest time, the only way I could survive living in New York City was doing yoga 6 days a week. And in the yoga world, they say that the yoga is not about having your fit body and it's not about your abs and it's not about even your flexibility, but it is about being able to sit long enough to hear the voice of God. That the 8 limbs are all designed so that we can sit, be still, and know. And to me, that is a daily practice to connect to our knowing. And at times it feels like a golden thread that we can lose sight of. I have experienced the pain of what it's like in life to lose my golden thread and to be so disconnected from it that I was in constant pain because I was not me in the world. And I'm sure people felt it. And I'm sure that they cared about me and didn't know what to do exactly about it. And I was frustrated by the way in which everything was playing out. And part of this healing journey, I'm really just so grateful that I'm in this partnership that I'm in. And she's an incredible healer and an incredible mother, an incredible partner. And part of our work I experienced with her was in front of a mirror. Part of the mirror work that she has done with clients and that I experienced with her is about claiming yourself in the mirror. And I'll tell you, the first time that she told me that she did that and that she invited me to do it, I was in full resistance. And the second time, I had a sense or a knowing, okay, now it's time to go and do this. And when I sat in front of that mirror, I finally made sense of what I've been told my whole life, which is you have to love yourself, man. And I was always like, yeah, yeah, or yeah, but. And it wasn't until that moment that I sat in front of the mirror and I found what loving myself is, what it looks like, what it feels like. And I made a pact with myself that day that I would see myself and that I would love myself, and that I would always have my back. And I haven't experienced anything like it, and I have not been the same since. And I am so incredibly grateful for that gift, the gifts that we all get to share with people when they're living their purpose. And that day changed my relationship to seeing myself, and it's in connecting to me that I experience my knowing, because my knowing exists inside me all the time. It's just about whether or not I'm too busy or if I'm getting quiet enough to hear it.
A couple things just kind of clicked for me, Joseph, hearing you speak there. Especially, it's really touching, and I can really relate to that. I'm sure a lot of people can. That experience of sitting in the mirror, looking at yourself, and saying, "Wow, like you need to love yourself," and then all the
Mm,
resistance to that and the challenge with that. But yeah, certainly, I mean, from my perspective and from what I've learned and seen in the work I do with folks, that's so much the key is somehow finding that tiny door to the heart, and so many things get in the way of us being able to access that. And
mm,
then you spoke about the golden thread. We lose touch with it, and then we stop remembering what it feels like. We can't find
mhm,
our way back. But it's so vital. It's
mhm,
essential for our health, for our well-being, for everything, to have a sense of knowing, as we've been speaking to in the world. And I was just thinking about your story and your work, in show business, so to speak, as a performer, and just what you're giving voice to on our show today, I feel like is so, I mean, you have a very kind of interesting performative version of it, right? Because you have
mm,
this professional identity, your name became kind of a passport into different worlds. And then when you changed it, it had all these impacts. So in hearing your story, I think we're able to see the dynamics that are playing out inside most all of us all the time, but it's coming through in a more performative way because you are a performer, sir.
mm, mm.
And when we think about these spiritual practices in general, we often get marketed this idea of like sitting and meditation and feeling the bliss of the universe, and it's also great. But everyone knows that what's really in there is frustration, annoyance,
Mhm,
trauma, pain, fragmentation,
yeah.
all of this process of being disconnected from ourselves. And yeah, I just I guess I want to thank you for doing
Mm,
your work and doing
mm,
your journey, and then being willing to share about it, because I think we can all experience, I mean, with anybody, right? We see ourselves reflected, but we can all see ourselves in some version in the story that you've described, I think. And
mm,
I think I'm just kind of curious, maybe just to speak to that a little bit more, that awakening and realization of love, self love. And I link that to some other things you've spoken about around wholeness and fragmentation, and this idea of becoming whole, of becoming integrated. And
mm,
we live in this kind of fragmented, broken world. We all have these different strands of ourselves that we're bringing together. I think about my own identity, and I won't get into that for time's sake, but my mother's side and my father's side and my cultural upbringing. And I know in working with Rahul for so long, Rahul, you have your own version and journey of that. And so we are so often seeking this meaning, that this touching this special thing beyond that you're speaking to, Joe. How do we find that? Or do you have any additional kind of, just take us any additional comments, or maybe you can take us down that road of self-love, wholeness, and what kind of effect that means for the world?
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind, and some of it started from even our time together pre this call. So I don't know if people get a glimpse behind the scenes of the beautiful way in which you connect with your guests, but there's a pregame that you invited me into. And part of that pregame included taking a moment in terms of the work that you do and to connect to gratitude. Because it's the month of November and because it's around Thanksgiving, I think people connect to a sense of gratitude, especially on the day of Thanksgiving around a table with food, or maybe there's other moments this month that that word gets thrown around. But I really believe gratitude is not as flimsy as that. I think gratitude is a powerful force, and that it is part of what is disruptive to the sense of fragmentation. So as a practice, if I could just share another moment, I had a moment where I found myself complaining a lot and irritated a lot. And I didn't really recognize myself in that. That's not the story that I tell about who I am in the world. But I was really annoyed and I was really frustrated and I was really irritated a lot. I was finding myself complaining. And I heard a voice inside me that said, "You are underappreciating your life." And I got mad at whatever this voice was. And I was like, "I'm a grateful guy. What are you talking about? Like, I'm grateful. I practice gratitude. I do my three good things. Like, I've understood the science and the neuroscience coming out of Harvard and UPenn. What are you talking about? You're underappreciating your life." And I really sat with what this was and I got over myself and I felt into it. And I said, "Okay, fine. So let's say I am underappreciating my life. What would you have me do about it?" And this voice said, "I think tomorrow I invite you to say thank you 1,000 times. Say thank you 1,000 times." That was it. There was no other instruction. And I was like, 1,000 times? How long does that take? And so I was like, all right, all right. How am I going to count to 1,000? Well, I have a mantra practice. I have a mala beads. Those are 108. So what if I did it 10 times? That's more than 1,000. It's 1,080. I'll say thank you 1,080 times. So I sat down and I said thank you. And what I noticed is, first, I got into a bit of a rhythm and a hum, the same way I do with a japa practice or a mantra practice, that even though it wasn't Sanskrit or Tibetan or something like that, the words started to take on an energy. And I started to feel really warm. And then I started to feel like I was noticing my life coming at me. It was almost like how we drive in a car for a long period of time. And it's like sometimes you can't tell if you're moving forward or if the world's coming at you. I had this weird moment in time and space. And so it felt like my life was coming at me. And I wasn't pausing to think of something to be grateful for and then say thank you. I was just saying thank you like an engine. And I was noticing things coming by and I was saying thank you for these things. And of course, I started with the easy, the stuff that's the low hanging fruit, the stuff that's like the job, the money, the opportunity, the love, the great food, like the things that are obvious that most people feel that swell of gratitude for and say thank you for when they have. And then I started to say thank you for the things that I take for granted that are more neutral, like, oh, my ankle's feeling a little bit better, or the sun is shining today. And it's been pretty cool and misty these last few days, and I feel that warmth in my bones. And then I started to say thank you for the hard things. I started to say thank you for the things that I was really irritated, frustrated, and annoyed by. And something started to happen. It literally was like transmuting that energy inside me. And it felt so good that I decided to do it again the next day. It didn't take very long, by the way. It was like less than 10 minutes. I don't know what I was thinking in terms of 2 words saying that 1,000 times, but I did it again and then I did it again. And I didn't really have a decision that I was going to do this for any necessarily length of time. As I do with mantra practices, I will sometimes do these 40-day sadhanas, these 40-day journeys. So I thought, okay, let me seek to do this for 40 days. One day I was on a vacation and I had just come from this beautiful safari with these beautiful animals and I'm in a car full of singing children. And I thought, oh, you better say your thank yous because you're going to forget before the end of today. And I said, no, 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 just keep singing, just keep enjoying the moment. And of course I did forget that day. And I had a choice to make at the end of that day. Am I going to like beat myself up? Am I going to pick myself up and do it tomorrow? Like, who am I obligated to? This is my choice to me. There's no monk that told me if I don't do this, I'm not going to complete changing my energetic relationship to karma. Like, this is my practice. So I kept going and I did it for over a year. I think I did it for a year and 3 months. And then just out of curiosity, I changed it up. And more recently, in the last 6 months, I brought it back. Gratitude is such a deep practice for me, and the way it applies to the easy, the neutral, and the hard is part of this integration work. And what I've found is it allows me as a man in the world to be in partnership and hold space better. It allows me to be grateful for whatever is being shared that I get to be a container for in my private life with my child or in coaching clients. And the energetic of love that I feel is the dominant force. Like, I just want to love people. And it feels very similar to what you both said about flowing with the conversation instead of the early days of podcasting where you'd plan it all out and have all the questions and things like that. Because I think flow is connected to love. I think gratitude is connected to love. And I think knowing is connected to love as well.
Yeah, I just love what you did there with, I could really relate to the like, yeah, like I've read the articles, I've done the practice. And what you're reminding me of, Joseph, in telling that story is the depth, the well of gratitude, or more, even more broadly, the well of love uh, goes infinitely deep, right? It goes infinitely deep, and we can keep tapping into that. And the more that we tap into that, it brings us closer to our wholest, most integrated, most powerful, most vibrant, most healed selves, right? And I think from that place, we just see the world in such a different way, And I think that I loved your analogy of of driving, right? And it's like, hey, what are we in competition with the road and what we're going through, and are we trying to get somewhere with a sense of impatience and urgency and losing ourselves in that process? Or are we in flow? Are we in harmony with the journey, right? And viewing anything that's coming our way, as part of that journey rather than an obstacle to the journey. And so I'm just really finding that metaphor to be really powerful. And so just kind of bringing it back to your framework and also conscious a little bit about time here, I feel like we really explored a lot around story. What I heard you just describe, to me, that's mapping to state, right? Like, how do we find that state that's above the line, that's expansive, it's beautiful, it's couched in love and possibility and generosity of spirit. And then there's the third one around space, which I know is our original premise, but we haven't kind of touched into that. And we'd love to just uh, kind of as my final question, hear from you, Joseph. Like, what's the role of space? What do we even mean by space? And how does that influence story and state? Or what is the connection between the three?
Yeah, so I love that all three of these can be mapped, whether you stack them or whether you put them on different sides of a triangle, they're all connected. It starts with story. And if we want to tell a different story or tell a better story, then we have to change the state that we're in. Because if we're depleted, if we're overwhelmed, if we're feeling, really connected to our anxious, anticipatory response, and we're in fear, that's going to affect the stories that we tell. And so by changing our state, it allows us to tell a better story. And we can change the state of our mind. We can change the state of our body. We can change the state of our energy. Ideally, we would address all three. That's going to allow all the stories that we tell that day and ongoingly to be even more impactful, more powerful. And so for the longest time, I developed all these programs through the company, The Performer's Mindset, at the intersection of story and state. The idea of positive psychology and flow and growth mindset and neuroscience, and what are athletes doing better than anybody else in the world, and how do we learn from them and apply that to our artists, our executives, and all of us in our everyday lives. The other half of my journey was really about the intersection of story and space, because our homes tell a story. And so often I'll come into somebody's space and the story that it's telling is of the past. It's like a museum. It's like, this is where I've been, this is who I know, this is what I've done. And most of our homes look backwards in time. And so if all of our conscious attention and our unconscious attention is looking backwards in time, what does that say about where we're going? What does that say about what we're calling forth? So for years and years and years and years, I get hired for the same reason as a feng shui consultant. People would say, I'm single. I don't want to be single. And say, wonderful. Thanks for inviting me over. Take me on a tour of your home. And at the end, I might say something like, okay, well, you're saying that you don't want to be single, but your space is screaming, I'm single. You have one nightstand, which indicates one night stands, and there's no space for anybody else. You have all these single images, even if it's like beautiful lounging women by themselves. I had one woman who literally, there were 37 single images as we walked around her home, and she was wondering why she was single. And the invitation is to start setting up your space as if you are in the thing that you seek. So your whole home becomes a vision board, and our home is one part of space. But then we also work places. So sometimes our work environment matters, or our car matters, or the clothing that we wear is an environment. So those are all spaces. So is our schedule. If our schedule's jam-packed, back to back to back to back, there's no space for anything. That's going to affect our state, which affects the story that we tell. If we feel tight and constricted and overwhelmed, and then it's our social circle of support. It's like us first in the center of that circle, and then our intimate partners, and then our babies or fur babies, and then our family or chosen family, and then the people that we empower to be our helpful people in our world, right? Our trainers, our coaches, our therapists, our best friends, coworkers. And so if those support circles are not there, we may not feel like we can surrender to flow. We might not feel like we can feel confident enough to go and do everything. It affects our state and therefore affects the story that we tell. So space goes way beyond just where our furniture is in a room, but it's the integration of story, state, and space that allow, when all three are optimized, that's when synergy happens. That's when synchronicity happens. That's when, all of the alignment is embodied and allows for the reflection of that in our outer.
And Joe, can you say just a bit more about synergy there? I have a
Mhm.
deeper question I have about space, but just speaking to, you mentioned synchronicity. We spoke earlier about love and wholeness. What is synergy as you define it when these things all come together?
I think the simplest version to me is like that the sum is greater than the individual parts, right? That when they're all working together, 1 + 1 + 1 equals more than 3. So win-win, everything makes everything else better. If our state is online, it challenges our state in our space. If our space is optimized, it downstream affects the state that we're in and therefore our story. So each thing works together towards this whole. And when things are in synergy, if we're in a partnership that is synergistic, we both bring out the best in each other. Whether that the best is our best selves or our most important healing, it's this idea that together there's this third entity. And so I think that synergy is that sense that everything's working in unison and there's a magic created that feels like it's bringing forth the best in all of the individual parts and all the people involved.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay. So, my last question is kind of practically oriented. So, I feel like we've
Mhm.
gotten so much information from you today, so much beautiful sharing about your own personal story, which is very touching. And then, Rahul's usually the one speaking to this, but it's like, the practical application, right? So, if I'm listening to this and I want to do something, and I'm going to use myself as an example here, how do I get started? What do I really do? In my case, I'm starting to think about moving. I might. We should catch up actually later, Joseph, because we've got some similarities. I have a young son. I'd
Wow.
love to kind of connect about that. But basically, I'm in some life transitions, and I'm starting to think about moving to a new place. And I think about maybe there's someone out there who's hearing your story around your name exploration, and that's sparking something for them, and they're thinking, okay, right, like what are all the pieces that I have? So how do we get started? If I want to think about these factors and about the role of space, state, my story, and I'm interested in manifesting a new home, what should I do? What should I be thinking about? What's the important orientation to have so that search process is going to manifest the expression of my own wholeness, my own synergy, that the process itself can be synergistic, synchronistic. Because I want magic, I want wholeness. I don't want to just move into, like you said, like space is not, I don't want to move into another box and live
Mhm.
there. I want to move into the next phase of my life and to experience the power and the joy of that. Before we let you go, I got to get some professional expertise and advice from
Yeah.
you.
So let's say for a moment that you are seeking better, whatever that means to you. You're seeking a better experience than before. Well, that's a different thing that requires us to organize our thoughts, words, and actions differently because if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. So, this idea of if you stay in your comfort zone and you don't get super intentional and you don't get clear, you may end up with a similar dynamic to your current place. So, how do we approach better? Part of it is allowing ourselves to be in the season that we're in. I think we go through these emotional seasons, and similar to the external seasons, some of us live in a place where we don't experience the seasons very often. I know when I first moved to LA, it was like 72 and sunny, 9 months of the year, smoggy too. And then it would like rain a little bit, and then it would be pilot season, and then we'd be back to 72 and sunny. But growing up on the East Coast, we had 4 full clear seasons, and so many people there hated winter. I hate winter. Cold, my joints hurt. Just want to get out of here. And I think that not only do people avoid winter in the cold, they also avoid emotional winter. And so every time somebody bounces from relationship to relationship and they don't take a moment to get still, get quiet, and go through a winter season where they really understand the lessons, where they really soak in and reconnect to their core and they soak in the nutrients of that stage, their spring will look different. If we bypass that, we're just going to have more of the same. That metaphor is also true with how we approach a new home. So it's possible that we may want to do a ritual of some kind of completion. Now, I know that there's this ironic thing that I notice all the time, which is as soon as I tackle the things I've been avoiding in my current place is when I manifest and attract the next thing. So I might say, I don't want to hang stuff on the wall. I'm not going to be here very long. But I want to invite you to think about what happens if you give love to your space so that every day between now and when you move, it is reflecting to you, yes, it is reflecting to you beauty, it is reflecting to you your intentions. What happens then? How does that not help you manifest the next thing? So the exercise that I would do is a bit of a stoplight exercise. I would start outside your home as you walk up and approach in your neighborhood. Then I would approach your front walk. Then I would approach your entranceway. Then I would cross the threshold to your home. And then I would move to the areas you spend the most time. And what I would do is I would do an internal gut check. Really simple. Red light, yellow light, or green light. If it feels like a green light, your space feels like welcome home. You know, like if you go into somebody's grandmother's home or kitchen and it smells good and it feels good and you just feel that love, that might be an example of a green light. Red light is like, get me out of here, like every horror movie you've ever seen, right? And yellow light is sort of like, meh, it's fine. So if you can just check in and go to each space that you spend time, starting with the external and moving to the internal, and go, is it a red light, a yellow light, or a green light? And then see if you can take 3 tiny steps to bring yellow lights and red lights towards green, whatever that means. Doesn't have to be all at once, but I know that there was a period of time when I wasn't spending a lot of time in my home and my plants died. And I was like, well, I'm moving soon. I'm not going to do anything about them. And that was the wrong move for me because every day that I went there, I felt sad. I looked at these dead plants. And so it was really an invitation from somebody who was like, come on, let's go and get you some new flowers. What do you want? I was like, I want rosemary. It's my mother's name. I love the smell of rosemary. I cook. I love the idea of rosemary. I run by bushes all the time. My son and I, we like smell them on our hands. We love rosemary. And I also got some roses. And so we grew roses and rosemary. And every day I was so happy going out and smelling them. We started this ritual. We'd go out and smell them together. 3 months later, we were moving. And so it's like completing the cycle is sometimes what it takes to move differently. And I think the same thing is true about gratitude. We get given this gift in the world. And if we want to attract something new or manifest what's next, the graciousness and the gratitude completes the cycle of the giving, completes the circuit. And then the universe gets to unfold to us what is meant next for us. So that's where I would start.
That's awesome. Thank you. I'm like looking around here. I'm like, okay, right. Yeah, there and over there. Right. Yeah. Got some work to do.
Oh, my pleasure, Rahul. I'm so grateful to be here with both of you. Gabe, I'd love to connect more about your upcoming move and your son. I'm excited to learn more about what you're both doing in the world. And I'm really deeply appreciative of the container you created for me to be able to share this part of this chapter of the journey. Thank you both.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, thank you for opening up and sharing about these things. I think some of this stuff is hard to talk about, and so for you to be coming out and sharing, I sense that is cathartic and for you and part of your own integration process, and it's so nourishing to others to get to hear because I mean I see myself, my own story in your story, and yeah, that's just so powerful. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our listeners wherever you're tuning in for tuning in with us. I hope this was inspirational and meaningful for you as well today. Feel free to go through our catalog of episodes. We've got so much great content, dating back a couple years really, if any of a particular topic speaks to you. And again, if you like the work that we do, we ask, share this with your community, share it with a friend. Please leave us a review. And again, you can follow along on our newsletter, which is linked in the show description. We'll also include some links, Joseph, is that all right, to your work in the show description? So if you want to get in touch with Joe, Joseph, or Ariel or Ariel, they'll all be available potentially if you reach out. So I think that's all I got today. But on that note, before the show, as Joseph pointed out, we started out with gratitude. You spoke to gratitude, Joe, as we went through the show. And so I want to give thanks that we got to make this show today, for the opportunity to be here, that you, whoever is listening to this right now, is hearing these words, and that, wow, hey, we're alive and we have so much that we can do to make this world a more vibrant and beautiful place. On that note, thank you so much for being with us. This again is Woven Wings Live, and we will catch you next time. Take care. you.